Hi, I'm Gene Benson. I created this video, Combating Mental Inertia, to provide one more piece of the big safety puzzle picture. The video begins by establishing an analogy between the physics of inertia in solid-state objects and our human desire to complete a task once it has begun. This is based on a cognitive bias known as continuation bias or continuation blindness. The concepts are then applied to general aviation, showing a flight from the beginning of flight planning through the approach and landing. We show how the further we progress in our planning and then in our flight, the more likely we are to continue, even when evidence to the contrary exists. Some effective mitigation strategies are provided to help pilots overcome this sometimes dangerous tendency. Important takeaways are summarized at the end of the video. I want to talk about inertia, but with a little different twist. Time for a little physics review.
Oh no.
Well, don't worry, it will be a very quick physics review. Yes, thank you. Momentum equals mass times velocity. Kinetic energy equals mass times velocity squared. Inertia is just a concept to help us understand and define mechanics. What determines the amount of inertia? Well, it's mass and velocity. So what about flight inertia? Our discussion of inertia just provides an analogy for our discussion. Which has more momentum or inertia? The 600,000-pound airplane landing at 150 knots or the 2,200-pound airplane landing at 60 knots? I think we know the answer to that. But our topic today is mental inertia. It's not physics, but the analogy is valid. In human factors terms, the concept is called continuation bias or continuation blindness. But we will continue with the term mental inertia because I think it helps us visualize the process better. What determines the amount of mental inertia? How about perceived importance of the task and the perceived urgency of the task? The FAA addresses this in an advisory circular. Advisory Circular AC 60-22 states, pilots, particularly those with considerable experience, as a rule, always try to complete a flight as planned, please passengers, meet schedules, and generally demonstrate that they have the right stuff. One of the common behavioral traps that the AC describes is get-there-itis. The text states, common among pilots, get-there-itis clouds the vision and impairs judgment by causing a fixation on the original goal or destination combined with a total disregard for any alternative course of action. This is a common phrase to be found in the probable cause finding of many general aviation accidents. The National Transportation Safety Board determines the probable cause of this accident as follows: the pilot's decision to continue. Now let's look at the components of mental inertia. Our unconscious mind works to actually block contradictory evidence. Lowering clouds, decreasing visibility, low fuel quantity, darkness approaching. Our brain wants us to complete the flight. So, back to mental inertia. Remember that it is perceived importance and perceived urgency that matters. Perceived importance, let's say that equals mass in our analogy, and perceived urgency, let's say that equals velocity in our analogy. Perceived importance times perceived urgency equals mental inertia. So what about perceived importance? Maybe it's a business meeting. Maybe it's a wedding. Maybe it's an in-law wedding. Maybe it's a sporting event. Maybe you have the tickets and others are meeting you there. Maybe it's a funeral. For an example of perceived importance, let's look at this. Let's take the business meeting. Probably important, but it could likely be rescheduled. A business meeting might be able to be rescheduled or even missed, so it might not rank high in importance. But the perceived urgency is increased if time-critical funding is at stake for this meeting. So again, we apply our physics analogy, we see that we get into the danger zone. Another example of perceived urgency might be if maybe you have promised to fly a member of the wedding party to the event, or maybe it's a funeral for an in-law relative. As the flight progresses, every step from beginning planning to approach and landing increases the amount of mental inertia. We could say that progression builds mental inertia just as acceleration affects solid objects. How about Newton's second law? Force equals mass times acceleration. We could apply this to mental inertia just as it would apply to solid objects. Each phase, from flight planning through approach and landing, increases our mental inertia. Just as a rock rolling down a hill gains inertia. The farther we progress, the greater a mental inertia to continue. So let's take a look at before takeoff. Where is the greater inertia to continue if weather is found to be bad at the destination? Well, how about 18 hours during the planning period before the flight? Not a whole lot of inertia here. But we get to 4 hours before the flight. Now the inertia is a little bit stronger to go. How about 30 minutes before the flight and the passengers have arrived at the airport? Getting a little more serious here, a little more likely to depart. And then it's time for takeoff, and maybe we have a rough mag, maybe the alternator isn't charging, maybe the sky looks dark in the direction of the flight. There's a lot of inertia built up here to make the takeoff. Let's take a look at after the takeoff. It's almost like we've had a reset of our inertia here, a fresh start. We're building inertia again. Weather forecast was good, but now the situation seems to be deteriorating for our 500-mile flight. 500 miles to go, we've just taken off. If things don't look good, we don't have a lot of inertia, and we might be likely to come back. We're 50 miles out into the flight. Well, we have a little more inertia now, but still, we would come back or divert if there was some sort of a problem that was a little bit more urgent. But now, we're more than halfway there. We have 200 miles to go on our flight. Much more inertia, much less likely to divert or to return. Now we're in our last 50 miles of the flight. Not looking good for our inertia. We have a lot here, a lot of continuation bias going on. And now here we are at our arrival. Maybe the field has gone below landing minimums. Maybe we have some unexpected strong crosswind. The runway has not been plowed or has some standing water. Yep, probably going to give it a shot. Let's take a look at some strategies to help mitigate the effects of mental inertia. Step 1, before takeoff. Move decisions from the subjective to the objective whenever possible. Have defined criteria for visibility, ceiling, wind, fuel, healthy airplane, healthy pilot, and so on. Refer to a personal minimums checklist. Here is an example of a portion of a personal minimums checklist. Or perhaps use a flight risk assessment tool or FRAT. Here is a sample FRAT. And of course, let's not forget our old faithful I'm Safe checklist. Here is some advice from an old pilot who has been around the block, made plenty of bad decisions, but has somehow come through it unscathed. Before each flight, ask yourself if the criteria set in these tools reflects the pilot you are today. Any of the items mentioned on the I'm Safe checklist can be present to some degree and may not be serious enough to keep us on the ground, but maybe we should revise our minimums upward a bit. Let me pause for a few moments to interject an example from my personal flying experience. Here's the scenario. A very good friend passed away in Peterborough, Ontario. Myself, my wife, and 2 additional family members wanted to attend the funeral. Peterborough is about a 4-hour drive from our home in Hilton, New York. I owned a Beach Duchess based at Ledgedale Air Park near Rochester, New York at the time. This is what Google Maps has to say about the drive from our home to Peterborough, about 4 hours through Toronto traffic. However, the Beach Duchess would make the flight to Peterborough Airport in about 40 minutes. Peterborough had a localizer approach. The ceiling was forecast to be right at localizer minimums. The nearest ILS was Toronto. At the time, I was very proficient and considered published minimums to be my personal minimums. Landing at Toronto, however, would have involved renting a car and fighting airport traffic, negating the advantage of flying the Duchess. Aware of my humanness, I did not trust myself to comply with localizer minimums at Peterborough. I set arrival time at our local airport for 5 hours prior to the funeral to allow for driving pending a final weather check. Passengers arrived on time. The final weather check showed the ceiling down slightly from the last report and right at localizer minimums. We all piled into my minivan and I drove, arriving with 30 minutes to spare before the funeral began. All right, our step 2, I think it's a good idea to pre-establish checkpoints to reevaluate the situation as we progress in our flight. The checkpoints can be time, geography, or any combination. Remember the space shuttle launches? Your go for throttle up? Somebody had set checkpoints, probably on a time schedule, to make sure everything was okay before they continued on. We can do the same thing during our flight. Here are some checkpoint examples. Maybe we set one 15 minutes out. Maybe another one passing a large airport en route that would make it easy to divert. Maybe as we approach rising terrain, we want to re-examine the situation again. And before beginning our final descent, we might want to stop and pause and take a look at things again. We want to again have defined criteria: visibility, ceiling, wind, fuel, healthy airplane, healthy pilot, etc. We'll see what the visibility looks like. No, that's not a very good idea because it's subjective and not objective. Better would be, we will divert if we do not have at least 5 miles visibility. We'll have 45 minutes of fuel remaining at the destination. We'll have less than 12 knots of crosswind at the destination airport. We will arrive before sunset. Of course, we would have had to have looked up the sunset time. The ceiling at our arrival airport will be perhaps greater than 400 feet for a IFR arrival. For a VFR arrival, obviously it would be much higher than this. And our ceiling, visibility, wind, fuel, healthy airplane, healthy pilot, and so on are observed as we go through our various checkpoints. Also, have alternate plans to get people where they need to go if the flight cannot be completed. Is it an ideal solution? Of course not, but it's much better than ending up like this. We should also empower our passengers to speak up if they are uncomfortable. They might see a gauge, a dark sky, and have an odor, see some traffic, and so on. We should use all available resources, and passengers can be a resource. Well, that completes our course, Combating Mental Inertia. I hope you enjoyed the course and used the information to make your flying safer. And always remember to fly like your life depends on it. Please visit my website at genebenson.com. I also have some books available on Amazon. Just search Amazon for Books by Gene Benson. And I have some online courses available for FAA Wings Credit on brightspotsschools.com.